Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for June 26th, 2020. And today is a pretty awesome day in my book. This is the 14-year anniversary of the 10th Amendment Center. I can hardly believe it. When I first registered that domain name, 10thamendmentcenter.com, back in 2006, I had a pretty modest goal. I was just going to start a blog, which I finally got going months later. I was going to start a blog. I was going to reach just one person or maybe a handful of people with a message of the Constitution and liberty. And obviously, as an organization, we've grown quite a bit since then. And I've actually grown a lot as a person too. I've grown and I've learned a ton doing that. So on this episode, I want to share with you, and maybe we can have a little fun with it, but there's going to be some serious stuff too, the top 5 things I've learned over these last 14 years. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Boldin. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There you can find all of the archived episodes of the show. I've been doing it for just about 2 years. Now you can find on each individual episode show notes. I've got links to everything that I talk about. Well, not everything, but the primary stuff that I'm talking about. Sometimes it's original documents, sometimes it's other articles, videos, podcasts, things like that. So you can read, listen, watch, and learn much more than what I go over in each episode. You can also find ways to follow us, like our email newsletter you can sign up for, or our social media channels. And since it's our birthday, this is the time where I've got to finally be comfortable asking for financial support. It's always been kind of a weird thing for me, but I know we can't get the job done without you putting your financial faith behind our work. So if you're able to, I hope you'll consider joining us as a member. It starts out as little as $2 a month at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And for those of you who are already members, I couldn't be more grateful for that. And I know a number of people have asked me over and over, what's the link if I want to do a one-time donation to continue to add to my regular financial support? And that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Okay, enough with the promotional stuff. I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. I'm grateful for all your support, whether it's financial or otherwise. But since it's Fast Friday, I got to do my best to keep this to 15 minutes or so. I'm not sure. I've got a bunch of notes, and this is going to be a countdown version of my top 5 things I've learned. Let's start out with number 5. First of all, I learned how to read the Constitution. I had the view, and I know a lot of people start out with this, I had the view that, well, it's written in plain English. Just read the thing and you'll know exactly what it means. But that leads to a lot of problems. And I would make the case, and maybe I should do a whole episode just on this, I would make the case that the just read it leads to way more centralization of power than the founders had ever authorized under the Constitution. To help explain this, let's go to Thomas Jefferson. This is a letter to William Johnson in June of 1823, and he put it this way: on every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. In other words, as Jefferson is telling us, when you want to understand any particular word, clause, or phrase in the Constitution, you have to understand it as the people who gave it legal force understood it. That is, the people of the several states through their ratifying conventions. And there's a lot of documented history of the state ratifying convention. So something that we could put a modern spin on because it seems logical could actually have a completely different view, a completely different legal meaning to the people who gave the document legal force. Going further, James Madison validated this as well in a letter the following year to Henry Lee. This is in June of 1824, June 25th. These are both June letters. And he put it this way: I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. So when I was thinking you just need to read the thing, and I used my own modern definitions for all the words, and I understood certain things to mean certain things, I was at odds with both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and I would think today there are many people who do that. But for me, if it's Jefferson and Madison, if it's their view on how to read the Constitution versus anybody else alive today, it's just a no-brainer. I'm always going to go with those two guys. Madison goes a little further on this, and he says, if the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, and this is really important, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject. In other words, he recognized that definitions of words change over time. Commerce, regulate, post roads may have meant one thing in 1787, 1788, and that time frame, and something far different in 1824 or 1860 or 1913, a pretty bad year, or 2020. Words changed. Meanings of words change over time. And we know this. This has always happened. And Madison went further. He acknowledged this even further. He says, what a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense, and that the language of our Constitution is already undergoing interpretations unknown to its founders. Just read it often means you're using a modern definition, something you grew up learning for a word, and imparting your own view of the words on the document instead of actually learning what the ratifiers understood those words to mean and how they approved it. And that is incredibly important. So number 5, I learned how to read the Constitution. I learned that you need dictionaries from the time of the founders. Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language is very easy to find, free online. It may not be the best one, but it's a very easily accessible one that was widely read for a popular dictionary. You also need a law dictionary like Giles Jacobs' New Law Dictionary, because the founders, even those who were not lawyers like James Madison, were well versed in law, so they often used very specific legal terms for the legal document. It's an 18th century legal document, which is the Constitution. So that's an incredibly important thing that I learned. Number 5. Number 4 that I learned, and this should have been obvious all along, is that most people treat the Constitution like a tool to bash their political opponents, or they treat it like toilet paper. And actually, most people do both. It just depends on what the particular political issue is or what team is in charge in Washington, D.C. And I've learned that people really love centralized power when their person is in the White House or their team is running things in Congress, and even more so when they've got it all. And that's because people generally, at least in modern times, are team players. They care more about party rather than principle. And they've never learned how to read the Constitution, so they just go with whatever their team is doing. They just want to oppose the opposition. So over the years, from 2006 to 2008, I was called all kinds of nasty stuff by all kinds of people supporting the current the administration of the time. Of course, I was an America hater, so was anybody who worked with the organization or volunteered. I was told that we were commies, that I should move to Cuba, or we were with the terrorists for opposing the Patriot Act or unconstitutional, illegal, immoral wars, for example. Then in 2009, the teams changed, the words changed, but the message was really the same. It's like, our people are in charge, so you must be bad for opposing federal power. But it doesn't matter what team is in there, it's always bad stuff. So we were called neo-Confederates or racists or anti-government radicals or the radical right, for example. And then in 2017 through today, again, another switch. The message may be the same. I mean, the underlying principles are the same, but the words are back to commie, or I've heard idiot Marxist, or libtard is a pretty common one. And they just flip and flop and back and forth, and it's always party over principle. And that leads me to one of my favorite quotes of all time. This was from John Adams, who later in his life was not really one of the good guys, but early on was one of the best, the hothead they called him. And this was in 1763 in the Boston Gazette, where Samuel Adams often wrote as well. And he put it this way. This is a short version of this quote, but I'll link to it in the show notes so you can read the entire thing. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And this is how Adams put it. I would quarrel with both parties and with every individual of each before I would subjugate my understanding or prostitute my tongue or pen to either. And he sure did not mince words, because that's what it is when you're a team A player or a team B player, when you're a red team versus blue team, and you're not focusing on the principles, on liberty, on the Constitution. That's exactly what's happening. So that was number 4. Most people treat the Constitution like a tool to attack political opponents when it's in their favor, or as toilet paper when it's not. Number 3, I learned a lot about nullification, but I also learned a lot about strategy to implement nullification. And I've learned a lot more as I've gone even further back in history to learn what the founders' experience was leading up to the revolution and the secession from the Empire of Great Britain. So we often think of nullification as actually originating from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in 1798 in response to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts signed by that guy John Adams when he was one of the bad guys later on. But they weren't really making it up out of thin air. They were really just putting on paper views and principles and theories which were widely understood, widely accepted, and widely used for a long time, even before the early days leading up to the revolution. And I actually did an episode on this just in May. This was on May 29th. Let me pull this up. Patrick Henry versus the Stamp Act. This was his 29th birthday, 11 days after he was first elected to the Virginia House. He drafted, and maybe he worked with some people, a series of resolutions against the Stamp Act. And he called for resistance and disobedience. And even the resolutions that didn't even pass, those were printed so widely around the country that they really helped spark the resistance. And this idea of resisting or disobeying acts of a far-off government that were not enacted by the local assembly, this is really a precursor to nullification. And I'm not going to go into too many details. I'm linking to this in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, so you can check out that episode at another time. I think it's really, really interesting, great history. But talking about Jefferson and 1798 and Madison, we have to at least look at that just a little bit as far as strategy goes, because the day after the Kentucky resolutions of 1798 passed, that Jefferson drafted in secret, of course, against Adams and the hated Alien and Sedition Acts, he sent this letter to James Madison encouraging the same, probably knowing that something was brewing there in Virginia as well. But he put it this way: I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain. For example, things like the several states are not united on a principle of unlimited submission to their general government, or whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, anytime its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. These are some of the principles that were included in those resolutions. And he said we should distinctly affirm all of them, not some of them, and not half-hearted, but really affirm them, so as to hold to that ground in the future, he writes, and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. He knew if you charged in like bull and try to get everything done in one fell swoop, you will oftentimes run into a lot of problems and not get anything accomplished. But of course, that doesn't mean throw aside your principles. You always have to hold your ultimate principle out there. You make it very clear, this is what I want to accomplish, and we're going to scrape step by step, brick by brick, building that foundation to go forward. That's number 3. I learned about nullification, and I learned about effective strategy. And that leads me to number 2, which is a Latin phrase that you find on our membership cards, which I happen to have here. It's Concordia res parve crescunt. It was written by a guy named John Dickinson, who if you regularly watch or listen to the show, you know this was a guy called The Penman of the Revolution. He was the most famous writer in the early days. In 1767, he wrote the first of a series of 12 letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania against the Townshend Acts, and he signed every one with a Latin phrase. I think every one. The first one specifically was Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. And I did an episode on this last June for our anniversary, Winning for Liberty, the story of small things grow great by concord. This is very similar to the notion that Jefferson was talking about in his letter to Madison. And I know that every step forward, even though we want 1,000 steps, even a single step leads to something great. And I think Dickinson was absolutely right as to what those things, those small steps led to in the years to come. So that's number 2, small things grow great by concord. And I also want to point out that it actually makes me think, and I pulled this up in my notes as well, makes me think of a great quote from Samuel Adams, also writing in the Boston Gazette. This was as Candidus on October 14, 1771, a letter I cite often, but I don't cite this phrase from as well. And it really talks about how, like, you take one step, but you're never satisfied with that. You know you have to keep pushing forward. This is what Jefferson talked about. This is what Dickinson talked about, and many others too. And this is how Adams put it. Instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies. Our enemies, Adams knew, would be very happy if we just took one small step and thought we were like, we did it, we're done. Good job, everybody. Pat ourselves on the back and we're good to go. No, because they can reverse that, or maybe they can be okay with one, like 99 of 100 things that they want done. That's of course the wish of our enemies. So instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, Samuel Adams wrote, the necessity of the times, more than ever, calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. And he goes on, let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. So again, number 2, small things grow great by concord. Dickinson and Samuel Adams, such inspiring stuff. And then number 1, I learned that if you're not catching flack, you're definitely not over the target. And at the 10th Amendment Center, we've caught a ton of flack over the years. Rachel Maddow, MSNBC, at one point did an entire 14-minute segment called Confederates in the Attic. Of course, this was during a time when if you were opposing centralized power, you were a racist or a neo-Confederate, or you loved slavery, stuff like that. And she did an entire segment talking about our work in support of nullification, attacking us as absolutely nuts and bad people. We also had Bill Moyers accused us of supporting nullification because we were just partisan. So he went out of his way to point out how, like, oh, nullifiers, you know, they only care because this guy's the president. And obviously we can see now that the track record shows that Moyers was just nuts. I wonder where he is now. In the Wall Street Journal, at some point, the editorial board, this is like 2012, 2013, the editorial board referred to the 10th Amendment Center as the ACLU wing of the Tea Party because they didn't like the fact that we were opposing indefinite detention under the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. And that same piece of legislation, our efforts on the state level to work to undermine or nullify that act in the states, brought us the ire of a guy named Charles Stimson, who was basically the Guantanamo Bay advisor to President G.W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld, along with another guy, David Rivkin, another neocon piece of garbage. They went to the Washington Post and actually said, oh, the 10th Amendment Center is fear-mongering over this indefinite detention thing. There is no such thing. So they don't like the fact that we oppose these things. In 2017, we made the Harvard fake news list. The Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, has had me listed not just on their list of dangerous organizations, but for about 7-8 years, something like that, they've had me listed and profiled on their site as one of 30 leaders of the radical right. And of course, we know when that was written. So the terms are probably going to change maybe they'll go back to that in the near future. And I'm not even counting attacks on our efforts in support of nullification that didn't mention us by name. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but they attack our work. We've gotten attacked by Esquire, Heritage Foundation, John Bolton, Jesse Jackson, CNN, MSNBC a bunch of times, Jeff Sessions, Mark Levin, and all kinds of other people who don't like our consistent view of decentralization, the Constitution as the founders and ratifiers gave us on every issue, not just on pet projects for one team or the other. And I consider that all a badge of honor. So that's my number one. You don't catch flack if you're not over the target. And I think we have been over the target for a long, long time. I guess I just got one little bonus one that just popped in my head. I guess a bonus one is, if you're going to get involved in activism, do it because you love it. Don't do it. I've seen a lot of people start groups and have really good project on a specific issue or on a broad range of issues. And I think a lot of times they want to make a living out of it right off the bat. They see other people have made a living off of it. I'm making a living barely scraping by. I've missed so many holidays because I couldn't afford airfare to visit family back east. All kinds of things that I've given up. I haven't had a car in ages. Now I've grown to love not having that vehicle, but I used to work myself sick. I'd work 80, 90, 100 hours a week. One year I got pneumonia through the Christmas season because I was working too much and not taking care of myself. I'm so thankful that it isn't as intense as it was, but I still do work very hard, and it is always just barely getting by. So I am able to do this because I love what I'm doing. If I was trying to be rich out of this, I would have had to burn out and give up years and years ago. So if you're going to get involved in something, if you're going to get involved in some type of activism for the Constitution and liberty, do it because you love it. Do it because you have a long-term vision. Don't have expectations of financial return or short-term results, because we know that small things grow great by concord. And when many people come together, you put the word out, you take one small step, other people can join you in that effort over time. And of course, I'm so grateful for all of you who have joined me today. I'm grateful for those of you, whether it's your first time here, you've been here for the last 2 years, for those of you who have been members for a decade or longer, or just a year, whatever. I'm so grateful for all of it, because there's no way I could get this work done without your help. Whether it's smashing a like button, subscribing, getting notifications, leaving comments, sharing links to each individual episode or to articles that are in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Or, of course, financial support, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, where you can join us for as little as $2 a month, or you get one of these nifty membership cards for annual, 5-year, and lifetime memberships. Or if you want to just pitch in with a one-time donation, I know a lot of people don't want to join anything as a member. You can do that at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I'm sorry I went over that 15 minutes, but this was fun for me to share these things. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. I mean, this wasn't really a super educational episode, but I hope you learned a little something about things that I've gone through, things that I've learned. I'm so thankful for everyone who has helped me get to this point, and I'm thankful for all of you here today helping me get to the next 14 years. All the people like Mike Meharry, Dave Benner, TJ Martinell, Nick Hancock. So many people have worked with us over the years and supported this mission for the Constitution and liberty. We're going to continue doing it and support the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions and no excuses. Thanks again for joining me here today. Thanks again for watching, listening, sharing, supporting, all that stuff. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.